what can really serve us here? What can help us move forward rather than keeping us stuck? So I was fascinated by the extent to which rewriting some of the scripts that are in our head can be helpful to this process.
You're listening to The Successful Bookkeeper with your host, Michael Palmer. Listen each week as inspiring guests share their secrets of success to help you increase your confidence, work smarter, and build a business you love. This episode of The Successful Bookkeeper is brought to you by PureBookkeeping.com, the proven system to grow your bookkeeping business.
Welcome back to the Successful Bookkeeper podcast. I'm your host, Michael Palmer, and today's show is going to be a great one. Our returning guest is an international best-selling author, speaker, and leadership coach with a new book out called Rising Together: How We Can Bridge Divides and Create a More Inclusive Workplace. Sally Helgesen, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Michael. Wonderful to be back here.
It's great to have you, and I'm looking forward to this book. Actually, I got one of your emails in my inbox today and was reading that. So interesting. It's such a world that's changing so much, and I'm really just curious to start off with your new book. It's like, what inspired you to write the book?
Well, it was a very specific moment. I had been asked to deliver a women's leadership workshop at the Construction Super Conference in Las Vegas. This was about a year before the shutdown. And I assumed it was a huge conference. There were 6,000, almost all men there. And I assumed that I would have about 100 or 150 women who were in the industry and having trouble having their voices heard or feeling really that their skills were recognized or respected in my breakout. But when I got to the room, I had about 300 people there. It was standing room only, to say the least. And most of them were men. And I could not have been more surprised. And so what I had planned to say was obsolete. So I asked them why they had come. And I heard, of course, a lot about that they were interested in doing a better job of attracting and retaining women because they felt that they would not remain competitive if they did not. But then one of them stood and said, "We hope you don't waste your time telling us why we need to get better at this. We get it. What we don't know is how to do it." So my thought was, this is something that most of us struggle with. How do we build strong relationships, whether they're with colleagues or with clients or in our community, with people that we may perceive as being different from us? Gender, of course, but also race, ethnicity, age, sexuality, and values. Very importantly, values. How do we do this? We all know we might get better at it and that it would probably benefit us, but how do we do it? So I decided that I was going to take that question on in my next book, and Rising Together is the result.
Wow. A book that's definitely timely and important. What was the process? Like, how do you write a book like this? Do you go into research? I mean, your whole life, it sounds like your career, for the most part, is really around this conversation, has been. But for this particular book, what was that journey like?
Well, the journey really began where I thought, okay, I need to do two things to get to the how here. The first is to identify very clearly what gets in the way. I knew that from having written How Women Rise, which I had talked about in a podcast on your program a number of years ago, that focusing on what gets in the way is really the internal barriers is really helpful to people. So first question was, what gets in the way of our being able to do this skillfully? And then the second question is, what kinds of practices can be helpful and widely adaptable at enabling us to do this? So those are the two questions that I had. What gets in the way and what specific behaviors can help us move forward? And to answer those, I did two things. First of all, you're right. I've been in this field of women's leadership and inclusive leadership for 35 years. So I have lots of experiences. I've listened to people talk on panels that I've led. I've done workshops in 37 countries. So I have a rich reservoir of material, but also I decided that I wanted to interview colleagues who are coaches. Most of my work is not coaching. I mostly do speaking and workshops, but I do some coaching, and I belong to a wonderful network of extraordinary coaches who work with executives and people really at all levels in organizations. So I thought I'm going to talk to them and choose a very diverse group of them, again, by gender, race, ethnicity, age, and sexuality, and try to hear what they find gets in the way and what is most likely to help people feel included. So that was essentially my research, was just what I've learned, what my colleagues have learned about those two areas, what holds us back and what can help.
We'll get back to the interview right after this word from our sponsor. Do you ever feel overwhelmed with your bookkeeping business? Are there just too many things swirling around in your head without a way to organize them all? Introducing Pure Workflow. It's a simple, easy-to-use workflow practice management solution which will help you manage your clients, deadlines, workflow, and team with ease. Forget about all the struggling to keep everything organized. With Pure Workflow, you can focus on what's really important, your clients. Its client management software gives you one central place to manage all of your client relationships and communications. Plus, Pure Workflow has a flexible reporting ability that will allow you to manage your team and monitor productivity and business results. It offers everything you need to hit your deadlines, manage your to-dos, and stay in control. Unlike other workflow softwares in the bookkeeping industry, Pure Workflow is built exclusively for bookkeeping firms and comes complete with all the templates, training, and documentation for best practice bookkeeping, so you can run your business like a world-class firm. So get your precious time back, reduce overwhelm, and get organized with Pure Workflow. Check out pureworkflow.com for more information. That's pureworkflow.com. Thank you for hearing from our sponsor. Now let's get back to the interview. Very interesting. I'm curious if you had any surprises along the way through that learning.
Oh, certainly I have surprises. I was really interested, particularly in some of the issues having to do with age, because I tend to work with more senior leaders in my work. And I heard a lot about emerging, I don't even want to call them conflicts, but areas for misunderstanding that are generational. And a lot of these have to do with communication, the words we choose, the phrasing we use. It can be different for people and the way we choose to communicate, whether we use phone, whether we use text, etc. These can be significant across generational differences. And one thing I've always felt, I've been around for a while, as you can guess, since I've been doing this part of my career for 35 years. One of the things that has always really bugged me is when I hear people of my age or a bit younger saying, young people just don't get it. They seem to, and going on and on. By the same token, I will sometimes hear younger people saying, old people, their ideas are so blah, 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 they don't understand. And I don't think this serves any of us, I have to say. And I've always objected, when people my age do this, and I say, they have skills we'll never have. They're built for this era in a way that we probably are not. We can learn from them. So I was really interested in this and trying to think of how do we communicate more effectively, be less triggered by how people who came out of a different era than we did communicate. What can really serve us here? What can help us move forward rather than keeping us stuck? So I was fascinated by the extent to which rewriting some of the scripts that are in our head can be helpful to this process.
It's interesting. I mean, I found myself say that, and I've found myself saying both those things in my lifetime, and I can remember thinking it when I was young, and I can now assert that I've said it as an older person with children and whatnot. And it's very interesting, and I like where you're going with it because it is communication, and it's like, what do we focus on? It's like differences. It's just different. The way they think, young people think, and what I was a young person, you were a young person, we were all young at one point. They think different. Their brains are actually different, and as we get old, our brain changes, and so that's just like focusing on the fact that it's they don't get it or they think differently. It's like, well, yeah. Of course they do. They have a different view of the world. So it's kind of like bundled into that, but it just seems like such a common conversation that happens and not a very productive one.
Well, that's exactly right. It doesn't really give us a path forward. More productive is when we hear people, I've been doing that for some years. When people my age will say, oh, these young people, I always push back. I always say, let's think about what we could learn from them. And then the two things that are important are, sort of identifying in our mind, what story are we telling ourselves about why they don't get it, et cetera, and finding a way around that. And then asking the question, what unites us? And most importantly, probably, what can I learn from people who have a different experience, a different orientation than I do? Let's get curious about that rather than remaining stuck in these they don't get it narratives, which really leave us no path forward, keep us isolated, and sort of serve a toxic environment of gossiping and saying negative things about other people. Very, very unproductive.
So true. I can't help but think like you must have been very busy of late because it seems like this conversation it seems so divided in the media. And I mean, we won't get into a whole conversation about media, but we could have if it was valuable, but I'd imagine we'd have to have a couple episodes just for that. But it seems like there's such a divide, and your book is about how we bridge the divide. And yet every day I open up and take a look at what's going on in the world is division. And like really seems like pretty, like I would say from my era, radical division and really bold division of these different conversations. Like you're one on one side and you're on the other side, and it's very vocal. And I sit back and I go, okay, I'm a small business owner. I work with a whole bunch of small business owners. They're listening right now. Small business. What do we do about it? What should we be paying attention to in order for our businesses to rise together, our communities to rise together? I mean, I know for our listener, predominantly there's many women listeners, and they run small businesses, but they work with other business owners, which has, entrepreneurs would traditionally have a high percentage of men working. So right away, there's potentially a divide, but then there's all sorts of other, people that they have different ideals, different ways of thinking, as you've gone through the whole list. I just can't help but thinking there's a lot going on around this topic.
Well, you're exactly right. And I have been busy. I've taken 2 days off since December 1. And it is partly because this topic is really front and center these days. I will say two things. The first is I have exposure to what I believe is as wide a circle of people as you could have. I work with all kinds of people. And I do find for the most part, for the overwhelming part, people are concerned about this. They do not like the idea of there being the kind of divides that there apparently seem to be these days. They don't like that. People would like to feel more comfortable with people who they perceive as being different from them. They know it would be more productive. The issue I have concluded, given so many conversations, is first of all, the media is unreliable on this, and for reasons that make sense, not because they're terrible or horrible, but because they get more views when they do programs and have guests on who are inflammatory and get people on what they think of as the other side inflamed. That's just a more popular topic than, let's talk about how this community is actually really getting along in certain ways. So number one, that's that. Politicians recognize that, so they pitch their message to often be more divisive, and the politicians who don't pitch it to be more divisive, who are more inclusive, are often dismissed in the media, as soft or weak in some way, or confused, or, not charismatic, for example. So that's the media is a distortion here. Social media, which we're all exposed to, is even more distorting, as we know, because the algorithms are updated constantly to try to feed people the most inflammatory content, because that's what gets engagement. So I believe that we are buying into a story that we are all incredibly divided and cannot bear one another. And this story is not really all that true. I live in a rural community, and I belong to a couple of groups that are filled with people who have very, very different points of view than I do. And we get along just fine. Do we avoid conversation on certain topics? Of course. Have we had fruitful conversation on these topics? Yes, we have. It is really important, first of all, to recognize and to assume, go in with an assumption of goodwill and demonstrate goodwill yourself. And this is something I talk about a lot in the How to Do It section of my book. How we demonstrate, how we give people the benefit of our goodwill and begin to create relationships that are positive and productive, even with people who have very different values or experience than us in that way. So I think that we're kind of being encouraged to believe this is more inflammatory and more divided than it is. And there are political interests and certainly media interests that are served by telling that story. And we kind of have to, filter out the noise and look to our own behaviors and think about how we can operate productively and happily in this environment, because that's the other thing, Michael. It's not a happy way to be, constantly being on the lookout for, this was a microaggression, or this must mean this person has no respect for people like me. This is not a happy way to be, and it's good to have workarounds for that.
So true. It can be disturbing.
Oh, yeah.
And I get what you're saying. And I think it's also, it's part of the diet. I have control whether I look at it or not. And I also like the reminder that social media is still media, and it It's all the same. Sometimes it's like naive about thinking, what am I looking at here? Is this really news? Like, news is, well, what's the weather? What actually happened.
What happens?
And social media is the same thing. Like, they want eyeballs, and they don't get paid unless people are clicking on their app or coming in and looking at the advertisers. So it's good. And I think that's why it's refreshing to have these conversations to remind us that if we walk out our door and meet our neighbor, we're likely not going to be throwing rocks at each other over some issue. We're going to be talking about the weather and about what's going on in their life, and those sorts of things, which that's really what's going on. Nothing, there's no it's not like the world burning down, which sometimes it can seem like through social media and traditional media.
Yes.
Now, getting back to your book, you mentioned that, and it is kind of on the same stream here, which is you mentioned 8 common triggers that are most likely to undermine our ability to collaborate across these divides. Let's maybe talk about that.
Okay, there are 8 common triggers. One of them, I'll just give a couple here rather than do a laundry list. One of them is visibility, and this really operates in the workplace, whether we have our own businesses or whether we work in organizations. Some people are better at making their work visible, at making their contributions visible. Some people are more comfortable talking about what they have achieved. These people often get more recognition. So if we are not particularly good at that, this can trigger a response in us where we're thinking, oh, that person's such a showboat, or he's always talking about himself, or, she doesn't really contribute as much as I contribute, and yet she gets more credit. And we can buy into this, this sort of narrative that the other people are doing something that we don't necessarily want to do. And I've heard women say this for 30 years, well, if I have to be a showboat like so-and-so to get noticed around here, or to get the kind of rewards for my client that he or she gets, no, thank you. I would rather not be noticed. So this is an indication that this person is being triggered by the visibility of whoever it is they're talking about, rather than, again, considering, okay, what do they do? How could I adapt this to a style I'm comfortable with? This other, the person who's more comfortable with it might say, I had the client eating out of my hand. We might feel more comfortable saying, I really felt a very strong bond with this client. We connected over similarity. Yes, our kids, an issue we have with health, whatever it is. So that when we are triggered by that visibility, that another person is good at garnering, it doesn't serve us, because again, we treat to a self-serving narrative in which we're a wonderful person and they're a terrible person, and that doesn't get us anywhere. So I really work in the book to present ways around that. It's also interesting that people who are very good at getting visible, people who don't have any problem talking about what they've contributed, can be triggered by people who are not good at it. Well, they're not a player. If they can't put themselves forward, what they do must not be very good. So that's another kind of trigger. So it doesn't just operate one way, but that's an example of the visibility trigger, which I find to be very active, across all kinds of boundaries.
I would say that one comes up often in this community because I feel undervalued.
Yes,
is often said amongst our community, and that has been it is connected definitely to visibility, making assumptions that if you do good work and you everything's correct and really done well, that someone's going to value that just out of the I've done this is very good, you should value that.
Yes.
But many times it's not the case. It's like, well, you haven't outlined that, you didn't set the expectations around that, and it's I would say that it would be something that comes up often.
I've seen it. I've watched it be active for so many years. I've heard people, well, I believe if I do great work, people will notice. Or I believe if I do great work, people should notice. Well, they probably should, but it's often doubtful that they will unless you find a way to bring attention to it, unless you find a way to articulate why it is important. And people who are reluctant to do that often dismiss that as just, being political or sort of, sucking up or whatever it is. But it's important because, and here's the thing that I've learned, Michael, if we are under-recognized because we are not intentional about bringing attention to what we have contributed, if we are under-recognized, we will feel undervalued. And over time, we will disengage because it is very difficult to remain engaged by work where we feel we are undervalued. We can't do that as humans. If we keep going and feeling undervalued over time, we'll just sort of give up on it. And whatever that means, whether it means leaving a job, whether it means leaving a practice, whether it means, not really doing what we need to do to keep certain clients, that disengagement will not serve us. So it is, and I've been talking about this for a while, it is imperative for every one of us to find a way that we are comfortable with bringing visibility to what we contribute and talking about it, getting comfortable, maybe asking somebody, I need to get better at talking about why what I contribute is important. We're going to be in this meeting together. I'm going to try to do that. Would you give me some feedback on how I come off? Because it's a new habit and I'm not really comfortable with it. A new behavior. It's something I'm not really comfortable with. We forget that we're usually uncomfortable with things we don't do a lot. So we want to do more of them so we become more comfortable doing them.
So true. And in this industry, there could be a disconnect in value, what people value. It's like if someone hands you a banana but you're allergic to bananas, you're going to be like, I don't want that banana. Maybe a bad example, but the point being is that in business, many business owners don't value the great work that bookkeepers do. They don't understand it. They don't whether it's right or wrong, whether it's perfect or not perfect. They really couldn't care, many of them, because they don't know why they should care. They're focused on other things, maybe. And so there is this communication and education, and maybe that's a better frame for it, is educating the value and understanding what is this person going to value, and then making sure that what they deliver, how they deliver it, make sure that that's what shows up is something and it's connected to something that other person would value. Otherwise, you're absolutely right. I hear all too often that people are unhappy or not satisfied with their work because they don't feel valued. That's a very, very big one that hits a lot. And I think it is changing, though. I think there's a lot of people in the marketplace that are helping, in our industry, helping people connect their value also with their paycheck, right? They're underpaid. Often they're not asking enough. They maybe don't feel valuable enough. So as people change the dialogue a little bit to, well, I don't really feel valued, but I get paid well, that maybe is a little bit of an improvement there, but I do see it a big opportunity for like you say, the conversation and communication to bridge the divide.
Exactly. And you have to tell them why it's valuable to their business or to what they're trying to do. It's not going to be valued just because it's perfect. First of all, they think, well, of course, I hired this person to be accurate. So that putting all that attention into the expertise and making the product perfect, you want to put about 20% of that effort into making sure that the client the customer really understands why what you do helps his or her business to be more successful. So being able to articulate that and work with others who can help you to get more fluid at articulating that is a great use of time and energy.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and so true, so true. So we that was a big one and a very good trigger. Maybe if we have time to tackle one more. Of course, all these triggers are in the book, which I also love the title. It's not talking about bridging divides and creating more inclusive. It's how we can do it. So I personally like books that educate, but also give a roadmap and tasks and actions to actually improve yourself or the content that you're working with. So I love the title, and you've told us there are ways and you've given instruction on how to, it's not just like, well, this is the issue, but it's also, this is what you can do about it.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the other triggers in the book that I don't think gets enough notice is how we build our networks. And of course, this is very important for people who work for themselves, who have their own businesses. How do we build our networks? And the most powerful networks, in my experience, are kind of modeled on old boys networks, except they are not exclusive in the way old boys networks were. So they're inclusive, but they function like old boys networks in that they're really specific in helping people to get more successful. That's what old boys networks were. It's about identifying, the guys who are up and coming and helping them and mentoring them and sponsoring them and making them more visible and having them make you look good. And often when we're outside of that arena, either, again, because we're a small business person, or it can be because of gender or race, so we don't feel included in the in-group, we form networks to try to make ourselves feel better about being excluded and to bond with people and build relationships, which of course is helpful and important. But we often leave out that part of good networks are really about helping one another to rise. So how do we do this? How do we leverage the relationships in the service of our own success and development? How do we provide ways for other people to get more successful? Do we introduce them to other people? Do we nominate them for awards? Do we do what we can to help them become more visible and to shine? So all those things are really important, and it can be a trigger because if we're not part of the in-group, we often naturally part of the in-group, then we can often feel like, well, they're only helping each other. Well, yeah, that's what they're doing. We can also help one another. We can be an asset for other people and engage them to be an asset that invests in our success. And this is really, really important. And avoiding that trigger of, well, of course, that's the in-group is really important.
So important. And I love the way you've talked about it. And I've never heard it put that way, the old boys club, but finding a similar functioning where you're in that community or network where everyone is motivated to help you rise in your life and your business, whatever the case may be. And I have seen examples of that. There's a very successful group called Accelerate to Advisor, which is led by Lisa Campbell, and that it really fits that. It's that community is there to have people do the very best to have them make leaps and bounds in the progress in their business. And it's not just learning something, it's the entire community rallies around each other to help them rise in their business and take themselves to a very, very, next level and a next level in their businesses. And so just connecting that it's often we don't think about it. It's like, oh, I'm going to network. I'm just going to meet people. It's like, no, where am I going to spend my time? Where am I going to go? Is that community there to just get to know people and have friends? Valuable, yes. But is that community there to help me rise up?
Yeah. And am I there to help them do the same? And thinking of it that way, so that we're not just building relationships, we're leveraging relationships at both ends, and engaging people to help us and being a resource for other people is a very powerful way to operate in the world. And I would suggest, especially for anybody who is running their own business.
So true. So true. The results that people get when they do that, it is remarkable. And not only do they get better results in their life, but they're happier and more engaged and have much more possibilities. I absolutely love the conversation, and I want to thank you again. I'd like to just ask if our listener wanted to learn more about you or learn more about your book, if there's a specific website for the book, if you could share that with us, that would be fantastic.
Oh, certainly. The best way to do it is to visit my website, which is sallyhelgesen.com. It's presently being updated, but the old one is there, and there's lots of information on it. You can find the book basically anywhere, and there are lots of good reviews of it on Amazon, so that can help you make up your mind. And I also am active and put things out there on LinkedIn and Twitter, and I have a Substack newsletter called All Rise. So plenty of ways. And of course, my website has a contact button on it.
Beautiful. Well, this has been absolutely our pleasure. On behalf of our listeners, I want to thank you for your generosity in coming on the show and sharing your wisdom with us today.
Thank you, Michael. It's really been a pleasure.
Wonderful. And with that, we wrap another episode of the Successful Bookkeeper podcast. To learn more about today's wonderful guest and to get access to all sorts of valuable free business building resources, you can go to thesuccessfulbookkeeper.com. Until next time, goodbye.
You've been listening to The Successful Bookkeeper with Michael Palmer. For more information and to download the resources mentioned in this episode, please visit us at thesuccessfulbookkeeper.com. Thank you for listening.